morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all today. So yeah, my day job is Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft just over 3 years. But my background actually goes much beyond that. So I've been working in cybersecurity for about 15 years. But if I roll the clock back even further, it starts from a business continuity and crisis management perspective. And that's kind of where I'm going to start from. I'm going to roll the clock all the way back. And I'm going to talk about incident management and crisis management in particular. But I always describe myself as working on the business side of cyber in essence. So my role is to liaise with Microsoft's largest enterprise customers. So it's multi-sector and multi-country. So they CISOs, CIOs, CTOs, and it's really from a number of different perspectives, and it's looking at what their challenges when it comes to cloud adoption, digital transformation, and why we're here ultimately is cybersecurity. But in the last 3 years alone, we have seen 3 major incidents. And obviously we can't escape the fact that we've had a global pandemic. We've also seen one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks in history, which we have accredited to SolarWinds, and obviously we have the war in Ukraine. But let me talk about my presentation today and why it's called Breaking the Cycle on Groundhog Day. Now, I'm going to hazard a guess that hopefully you've all seen the film Groundhog Day with Phil, aka Bill Murray. And the film, in essence, is that the same day repeats itself over and over and over again. And it progressively gets worse and worse and worse. And the cycle, in essence, is only broken once Phil decides to make a positive change. So rather than thinking about myself and what's in it for me, what do I do for everybody else? And how am I going to make this change? Now, I think it's an interesting thing is when you think of how long did the Groundhog Day actually last? So there's always geeks on the internet who try and work it out. And so it depends on who you look at and what they say. But they reckon he was in Groundhog Day for 33 years. And the pretense of that is not only he had to learn French poetry, he had to learn how to play the piano, he had to learn all of these different things and be in the exact right moment at the exact right time for the perfect day, if you like, to go ahead before that kind of broke the cycle. So I'm not suggesting that we're going to have to wait 33 years before we make this change. But in essence, it really does beg the question, how bad does it have to get before we make a change? Now, if I roll the clock back, my career kind of started over 25 years ago, so I'm not quite 33 years yet. But I started working on the Millennium Bug, and kind of just my career kind of went from there, and I found myself on the front line of many, many major incidents. But in October 2021, for Cyber Awareness Month, I did a little A to Z on LinkedIn. And every day was a different letter, in essence. And one of my colleagues in Australia said, you should really write a book. And I was like, yeah, of course, yeah, because I have time to write a book. I went, no, you really should write one. So in October last year, I did actually publish my first book, which is Effective Crisis Management, but I was true to form in terms of keeping the A to Z. But really part of the book, it's not only just kind of looking at A to Z and what is kind of effective crisis management, how do you lead in a crisis? But I also had a couple of case studies, and they just happen to be the very worst examples of their kind. And I'm going to kind of share some of those with you and some lessons learned. But first of all, I want to just talk about the fallacy of the black swan. Now, if you're familiar with a black swan event, it is typically an event so big, such magnitude, you couldn't have possibly predicted it. Now, the famous black swan, I'm sure you've all kind of heard about, is 9/11. And this is kind of like one of those events. You couldn't possibly predict it. But if I just kind of roll the clock back a little bit for you, So hopefully you can kind of see all the terrorist attacks that had happened on the run-up to 9/11. And what you'll notice is that hijacking was the modus operandi at the time of many terrorist attacks. And in fact, the one that preceded it in Istanbul was just a few months before. So there's only a kind of a matter of time when we kind of think, well, if I hijack a plane, what am I going to do with it? And so we're thinking about what happened from 2001 onwards. Well, every single year from 2001 up to 2019, I'm going to come back to that date in particular, we have seen multiple terrorist attacks. Some of those will be familiar to us. So actually 2005 was the 7/7 London bombings. And that just happened to be my first day on the job at EY. And kind of a lot of these major events as kind of followed me around, as we'll come to look at. Now, the interesting thing with some of these major incidents is not only what happens because there's been so many fatalities, so many questions that get asked. How did this event happen and how did nobody detect it? Well, in fact, they did actually detect it. So the 9/11 Commission report was actually issued in 2014. And one of the chapters is actually called Foresight and Hindsight. And it's very easy when you have some of these major incidents to be able to kind of look back with the power of hindsight and say, we had all of these different opportunities, and we're kind of, what do we learn now? What's the power of foresight? So I just want to kind of share with you some extracts from that in particular. And so the 3 years before, they were actively tracking bin Laden. They had identified that he had a very strong philosophy. He had a global network. He already had analysis. He already planned that he was going to train pilots to actually fly into a building. This was all known, but it was all actually known by multiple different areas of the intelligence services. So the FBI, CIA, all of these different things. The interesting thing, there was 10 missed opportunities between January 2020 and August 2021, where they could have stopped 9/11. And so there was just a few weeks before this incident of this magnitude could have been stopped. Now, the more recent event I've already mentioned, which is also classed as a black swan, is COVID-19 itself. So I said about 2019. What you'll notice since 2019, there haven't been many terrorist attacks. And that is not to say terrorism has gone away, but a lot of the terrorists didn't really want to travel during a global pandemic. But actually, when we think about, oh God, how we have been in this pandemic, how did we get in almost 3 years, millions of people who were killed, multiple infected, there's still people dying today. But actually, if we roll the clock back, this is not the first pandemic that we'd seen in the previous 10 years before that. In fact, in 2009, we had the H1N1 swine flu pandemic. And what you've seen is that we actually had 3 coronavirus outbreaks during that time. So being able to turn around and say COVID-19 was a black swan is also not true. Now, 2009 was actually a very interesting year for me. And it actually ended up, I can affectionately go back in time and now refer to it as my year of crisis, because I actually had multiple events on the bounce. The H1N1 pandemic was actually the second one. The year actually started with this guy. Now, does anyone remember the IT company called Satyam? Does anyone remember that name at all? They don't exist anymore. Let me tell you why. So Satyam was one of the darlings of India's IT companies. And it was actually set up in 1989 with about 5 people. By 2009, Satyam had over 50,000 people However, 10,000 of those people didn't actually exist. In essence, the CEO and the CFO had been cooking the books for a number of years to overinflate the value of the company. So why did this all come to light in 2009? Well, the year before, we actually had the financial crash. But up until that point, in essence, what the CEO was doing was siphoning money out of his own company. And if you kind of remember when a lot of companies were moving services to India, so all the call centers, and so the land to be able to have these buildings in Hyderabad, Bangalore, and various other cities was worth a huge amount of money. And he kind of wanted to get in on the act, but he didn't kind of have the money. So the 10,000 employees that he made up, the salary for those 10,000 employees was actually siphoned out of the company to pay for all of these buildings and everything. Now, the pretense was, if I overinflate the value of the company, I will win new business and it will kind of catch up with itself. But obviously, he wasn't expecting the financial crash. And so in January 2009, he actually wrote his resignation to the board, actually saying, yeah, I kind of committed this big fraud. Now, the tune of the fraud, this is actually classified as India's Enron. So a $700 million fraud. And my role in this one is that I was working with a global financial services company when I worked at Fujitsu. And Satyam were providing all of the remote infrastructure management into the data centers. They ran the network operations center. And we had 8 weeks to try and figure out, how do you take on a global service without any staff, without any procedures, and without knowing anything about any of the technology? Now, the reason why I wanted to bring up this in particular is it really goes to show the impact and dependencies and trust that we have in third parties. Now, what is quite interesting, we was like, oh, we'll just lock Satyam out. And they were like, yeah, well, Satyam actually control all the networks. So they actually control all the Active Directory. So when we sit here going, we'll just lock them out, like, actually, they can lock us out of our own network. And it kind of dawned on us just how much trust we'd put into this third party and the impact of that in particular. And so we kind of coming up with all the novel ideas. Well, how are we going to secure and get back this environment? And we kind of said, we're going to have to go into the data center and literally start pulling network cables out of servers. That's kind of where we went to. We want to control our network and get it back. We're just going to have to pull. Now, imagining that this is a global service for a financial services company, and we got right down to the wire of kind of coming back to the point of no return. And another tech company called Tech Mahindra, actually came in and bought this company for 7 cents a share. So they were able to literally take on this entire company. But kind of a lesson learned there. We talk about supply chain attacks in particular, and we've really kind of seen the front actor behind SolarWinds, that we refer to in Microsoft as Nebelium. They have actively been targeting IT service providers because the level of trust that still exists today, 14, 15 years later, and they can just use it as a backdoor access. So have we learned any lessons? I don't think so. So keeping on the theme of cyber in particular, I just want to talk a little bit about Colonial Pipeline that you may remember from May 2021. Now, the thing that makes this interesting is a couple of things. So when the CEO actually had the ransom demand, he paid the ransom within 4 hours. So he hadn't consulted the FBI, hadn't done any of those things. He also made the decision to shut the entire pipeline down, even though the ransomware was not in the pipeline. It was actually in the financial billing system. So his rationale for shutting the pipeline down, well, if I have to shut my billing system down, I don't know how much to charge you for all the fuel that you're utilizing, so I just shut the pipeline down. Now, the pipeline itself is approximately 5,500 miles, and it basically covers the entirety of the east coast of America. The pipeline itself ended up being down for about 5 days. And you can imagine, therefore, the amount of panic buying that goes into all of those different things. But it wasn't only, it's all fuel. So it's diesel, it's petrol, but it was also airline fuel as well. So a number of different airports actually either had to divert planes or actually shut some long-haul flights down from there. So there was absolute carnage. Media was going absolutely nuts around this. It's like how this person had just decided to shut the pipeline down for his own kind of selfish reasons, in essence. But the interesting thing was from there, what it resulted in was the fact that 2 class action lawsuits. So one of them was filed by 100 different plaintiffs from multiple different states, basically stating that the Colonial Pipeline was negligent in the level of security or lack of security that they'd had and their decision to shut the pipeline down. So this is going to go to a grand jury. So we haven't yet seen the outcome of this. But bearing in mind, when you go to a grand jury, we're talking millions, if not billions, of compensation. The second class action lawsuit was actually created by a law firm acting on behalf of all 11,000 petrol filling stations across the east coast of America. So their argument was, well, obviously I've run out of fuel, we've had panic buying, but also when you go and fill your car up, it's more than likely that you'll buy some sweets, you might buy some cigarettes or various different things. So they lost all the money during that 5-day period. So there's a second class action lawsuit. But actually what is interesting that normally happens, we identify even from Microsoft, is the fact that when you pay for decryption key, they're pretty rubbish. They don't actually work. They're full of bugs. And so the decryption key really didn't work very well at all. And they actually ended up having to revert back to backup tapes anyway. But because of the amount of media attention, Colonial Pipeline's customers were actually hit by a second round of ransomware. And in particular, the security company Inky basically identified that phishing emails were going out to all of Colonial Pipeline's customers saying, we fixed the problem, that how we got ransomware. So all you need to do is click the button and that will download some software and fix the problem. Actual fact, when they clicked the link, it downloaded malware that then released ransomware into all of those customers as well. So you can kind of see the perfect storm of what happens when you make wrong decisions. One of the things in the book is really talking about lessons. And we, as an industry, are very, very bad at learning lessons. I've just kind of given you a few examples, but I also want to talk a little bit about lessons from Grenfell Tower itself. Now, I think we've probably seen this on the news, so it's one of those horrible, ugly 1970s flats that we've kind of seen popping up all over the UK. And so the local government kind of agreed with that, and in May 2016, they signed off to have some work done on this particular building, to have cladding put onto the building to make it look more attractive, to modernise some of the infrastructure inside. The thing is, when you have a high-rise building, particularly a residential building, there's always a plan for the fire brigade about how you evacuate that building. And so the problem was nobody actually told the fire brigade that this cladding had been put onto the building. There'd been no testing, no change in any of the procedures. And so 1 year later, when we actually had the fire, all of the plans, all the procedures were still based on what the building looked like here. Hadn't taken into consideration any of the changes, any of the problems that may have been incurred. And so like a lot of high-rise buildings, residential buildings, they had a stay put order. And so when people are ringing up and saying this building is engulfed in flames, the people who were inside the building were told, do not leave, do not evacuate. The fire brigade are on your own. So each of those apartments were actually built to have a fire break in them. In essence, just to give you enough time that if there is a fire, particularly if you're in one of the high floors, that the fire brigade will get there, you'll be able to put the fire out and not cause as much damage. Now, the interesting thing here is the deadliest structural fire since Piper Alpha and the worst UK residential fire since World War II. Remember about lessons learned. So the BBC, the following year, actually published a report and documentary on BBC Two. And what they basically said is these were all the fires that foretold that this was going to happen. So we've gone right back to the 1970s. We had an amusement park in the Isle of Man that also had this kind of coating put on and everything else. And that ended up with 50 fatalities. But if we kind of go round, even to 2009, where we've had more residential fires, more of these things, and still nobody did anything, nobody changed any lessons. The reason why this is very interesting is the fact that this has been split, the actual public inquiry has been split into two. And I'm going to explain why that's so interesting and why it's so important. As I kind of touched on, when you have an incident of this magnitude, it really requires you to think about the level of investigation. And a lot of investigations are very simplistic. They'll say, well, the cause of the incident was a fire. There was an issue in one of the apartments, and that's why it all went up in flames. That is not the reason that building caught fire in the way that it did and all those people died. And it's only that when you have a public inquiry with the resource, the time, the effort to do a full investigation, and that means going all the way back, looking at all of those missed opportunities and asking difficult questions about why nobody did anything about it. So the two things that we're really trying to look for is the X. X marks the spot, which is really about what happened. And this is really thinking about the timeline. So all of the events, the chronological order, what happened and when, who did what decision was made, was it the right decision, what was the outcome of that decision? The more difficult question is why. And that's that kind of having to go backwards and really dig deep when we think about why this thing actually happened in the way that it did. And again, it kind of begs the question, how bad does it have to get before you're in this situation and before you are willing and able to actually really ask why? So the reason why I said Grenfell Tower in particular was very interesting is that the inquiry was actually split into two. And so the first part of the inquiry is that what happened? But what you'll find as well is that there's always a time lag between the actual event and being able to issue a report. So the first phase was issued in 2019. And that was really, again, looking at the cause of the fire, what happened, that kind of timeline. And so the person who led the inquiry, he made a promise to every family member of each person that died, is I will tell you categorically why that person died, in the circumstances they died, and what we should have done to stop it. Now, we are currently at phase 2, which is that kind of the why. Phase 2 report has still not been issued. And it's like really deep analysis of all the decisions that are made, all the actions that people take, looking at the adequacy of regulations, were regulations even followed. Now, the interesting thing really is when you look at the level of documents and evidence that people have had to go through to get to this point. So the first inquiry was just over 20,000 documents. The second phase was 320,000. So the inquiry has had to go through every single piece of evidence, every single interview, all the photographs, all the reports, going all the way back, and really kind of looking at where they are. So where we are today, they have now finished compiling the information together, and they are now writing the report. So we probably expect that report maybe to be issued maybe next year. The other thing that's quite interesting, and I would really encourage you to be able just to look at a public inquiry, because it's very revealing. And sometimes even just looking at the exec summary, you're like, this sounds very familiar. And what I wanted to kind of show you is that in most events, they will always say something very, very similar. And I just want to kind of touch on some of those with you. And I was want to talk about why plans fail, why they don't work. And this is kind of one of the things that I've already spoken about already. So we don't communicate changes. And so if you kind of think about when a system goes in and it goes live and we do all the testing, we do all the things, and then we commit that when we make a change, we'll do a disaster recovery test, we'll check the backups, we'll do all the things. Yet when we have a ransomware attack or any of those type of situations, nobody can answer the question, have we got a backup? When was it tested? Have we done a full restore? When was the last time we done a restore? But obviously during that time, there's been multiple changes in that system and in the design. If we don't communicate the fact that you've had all these changes, people are still looking at a plan that was written years ago. So when you then kind of try to implement that plan, people are then surprised it doesn't work. Or the timeline that you thought that things were going to be recovered in also do not get recovered as expected. So the other issue is about communication. And then normally what we see in a crisis management scenario is a hierarchy before any decisions can be made. So they have to go all the way to the top, wait for someone at the top to make a decision, and then go all the way back down. The problem is with that hierarchical decision making is as each layer gets told and they communicate up or down, there's a change that happens in that level of communication. It's like a Chinese whispers in essence, because people interpret things in a different way, or they'll tell you the bit that they think is important that you need to know about. And so actually, this is what we find is what's known on the ground and what's known at the top is completely different, and vice versa. And so when you have something really, really important to tell someone, and you want to make sure 100% they receive the message, they understand the message, you tell them directly. You don't rely on the fact that the multiple layers of management are in the way and someone somewhere will give me an update. You tell them directly, particularly the people on the ground, those that actually need to know what to do and how to do it. And this really comes down to that level of command and control as well, because there's a kind of an expectation that we have that when you're in a position of seniority, you understand what to do. You know how to manage a crisis. So a lot of the board and a lot of senior managers will be very good at managing the business, not so good at managing a crisis. But we have an expectation that just because you're a senior, whatever decision you make is the right decision. And nobody challenges that decision, even when they know that decision is wrong, because people are fearful. They're fearful if I put my head up above the parapet and call it out, somebody is going to kind of tell me off or shoot me down. And so we need to then make sure that the other problem that we have is people are all trained in their specific role. Now, if I take out multiple of those people, I'm not suggesting that they've been involved in the incident, but people are on leave, they're ill, they're whatever. And so people don't know what to do. They get stuck because that's Bob's job. Bob knows how to do all those things. Well, Bob's not here. So what are we going to do about it? And that really then means that people have to improvise. And we really don't like people having to improvise, but sometimes you don't have a choice. Now we go back to Grenfell Tower as an example. So the first people on scene were not the commanders. These were normal fire brigade, normal police, and they didn't know what to do. They were panicking and they waited. They waited for somebody in seniority, in command, to give them an instruction. Now, the problem, if you sort of, when you have these incidents that are happening so fast, you cannot wait. You have to take an action. And you have to do something, which also means you have to empower people in this situation to be able to make a decision. And that might mean they make a wrong decision because they don't have all the facts, they don't have all the information. But you then have to think about what level of support are you going to provide to those people when they do make the wrong decision, or how they've come up with the decision that they did, or why they make no decision. And I think it's just important. There's a big difference between no action and inaction. Inaction means you've done nothing. No action is a deliberate choice to do nothing. They are very, very different, but when you're in this situation, you really need to be able to call that out. So another thing why plans fail is incident response. They're too rigid and they're planned for a very specific scenario. Now, any of you that have been in a major incident will know that whatever you've planned for is not the thing that actually happens. So there are multiple things that go off piece, they go in multiple different directions. And again, people get stuck because the plan is written in a chronological order. You're not supposed to go from one action to the next action until you've ticked it off. But if you haven't met the criteria for some of these actions, people don't know what to do. It's like, I don't have a plan for this. I don't have a scenario under my, I don't know what to do about it. And so we also need to make a very, very clear distinction between an order and a recommendation. So again, an order is something you absolutely must do. And obviously a recommendation is you could do it in this situation. What we're looking for is the critical path. In essence, this action cannot start until this one is finished, or this one has to run in parallel. Now, what happens if this one hasn't started, is still running? You need to understand the consequences, because it could mean the whole plan either goes out the window, the timeline goes out the window, what you thought was going to happen didn't happen, and therefore the whole plan is in essence collapsed around itself, hence why you can't be too rigid and you need to be able to know what to do. So from a training and awareness perspective, it's quite obvious, really. If we don't train people, we don't provide awareness for what to do, particularly what to do if something goes wrong. It's very easy to plan for something that goes really well, but that's not the thing that you should be worried about. The thing that you should be worried about, and what we're training people for, is when it goes completely wrong, completely out of the window. What do I do in this situation? What do I do when plan B, C, D, E doesn't work anymore? And I've kind of just sat there thinking, I'm the only person that has to make a decision. I'm the only person available that is kind of the last man standing almost. And what do I do in that situation? And it's very important, therefore, that we really kind of consider having that assume compromise, assume failure mindset is critical, because we have to assume the best will in the world, things are going to fail, things are going to break, things are not going to run as they should do. And that is really the importance of doing tests and exercises. And a lot of the exercises that I've seen are too simplistic. And when you think about running a crisis management exercise for some of the execs, let's say it's a ransomware attack, it's done in a very nice environment. It's probably done over a couple of hours. They all had their tea and coffee. They're given this scenario, let's say ransomware. And they're like, do you pay or not pay? Well, obviously we're not going to pay. We're just going to recover from backup tapes. And yeah, backups, we have those. And we'll be back up and running tomorrow morning. Great. The reality of that is so far removed that when they're actually then put into the situation that they've tested for, they have zero, they don't know what to do. And it's so far off piece. So actually what we want to be able to do is put people in a stressful situation, but not throw them straight in, because that can make it even worse. We kind of want to be building up the level of confidence, throwing these kind of left field things at them, and really, really testing what they do under pressure. And I can tell you for a fact, in my sort of 20-odd years, I have never seen one company that goes anywhere near their worst case scenario. I don't think a lot of companies even know what their worst case scenario is. But if you don't go to that edge and beyond, how do you know how you're going to react in that situation? So kind of just to kind of round things out a little bit, really, this is kind of what do we do then? What's key? And it really is, looking at from a strategy perspective, is really kind of going right to that end. What genuinely is the worst case scenario? Can we go anywhere near it, and can we go beyond that? And therefore, where are we today? What is the size of that gap, and where do we need to go to get to that point? The second one is then really around opportunities. And it's really then, when you think about some of these major incidents that have happened or near misses, you kind of go, oh, thank God that's over with. Or do you kind of look at it as if it was the real thing? And what if this hadn't have fixed in the timeline? What if it had gone worse? What if people had made the wrong decision? And kind of following all of those things through. Now, I used to think that I was jinxed, that everywhere I went, I was kind of in the middle of these major incidents. Even when I joined Microsoft, as I joined, the UK was going into lockdown. So I spent the first 18 months of my career working on Teams, funnily enough, just like a lot of other people. But actually, then I kind of thought to myself, maybe I am exactly where I need to be. So rather than thinking about it, oh, woe is me, and I'm always in the middle of these big crisis situations, what's the opportunity? What do I learn from this? How are we going to make that positive change that we were talking about? And in essence, this is not about trying to stop every attack, every incident, every failure, because that is not how the world works. But it's our ability to kind of preempt and pre-build and anticipate all of these things. So even with the pandemic, this is not the last pandemic that we're going to see, and we're no doubt going to see one even worse. And the same could be said for all of the cyber attacks. It's only a matter of time before we see a cyber attack so big that it's going to cause an industrial accident, and it's going to cause fatalities. And at some point, we're all going to be sat there scratching our heads and go, how did we get to this position? Why did we not learn any lessons? I know, let's have a public inquiry to find out why. And that's kind of where I'm just going to end in terms of, in essence, what will you do to break the cycle? You as an individual or you as an organisation, because every little step you make, every little opportunity that you take to make a difference all contributes. So please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, on Twitter as well. And if you'd like to buy my book, shameless plug, all the better as well. But I think we're going to have some questions, Claire.
So my question, I've asked it a few times with a few people, but how does Microsoft protect Microsoft?
Great question. Well, let me put things into a little bit of perspective. So you think of Microsoft as a hyperscaler, in essence. So I'll tell you what it is that we are dealing with, and I'll tell you about how we protect Microsoft. So every single day, we collect, process, and analyze about 70 trillion signals. Now, that's coming off the Microsoft cloud. So when we talk about the cloud, it's M365, it's Azure, and it's Dynamics. But you think about every single device that's running Windows, anything which is connected to the internet, in essence, So every authentication request, every email, Bing, search engines, Xbox, LinkedIn, GitHub, all of those things are generating signals. When I started, that was 6.5 trillion. And so you can see this, the number of signals is going up and up and up. And that kind of the attack surface is also growing exponentially. And so how do you make sense of all of those trillions of signals? Well, we have 10,000 people working in security. So these are a mix of researchers, the analysts, data scientists, engineers, and it's these people who are making sense of all of those trillions of signals. So we use huge amounts of machine learning, data analytics, and we turn that into actionable intelligence. And all of that goes into a feedback loop in terms of all of the Microsoft products, security products and services that you might be familiar with. But in essence, we are also looking at what's new, what's different, how the attackers are evolving. And so we are actively tracking about 300 different threat actors. So it's about 140 nation-state actors, ransomware operators, and what we call dev groups, which is a development group. So this is where we can't 100% attribute to a specific actor. It's a new campaign, it's something different. And so because we are the second most attacked entity in the world, believe it or not, so only second to the US Department of Defense. So if the attackers aren't trying to get Microsoft, they're trying to get our customers. So from our own CISO's perspective and our own infrastructure, we build all of our own internal capability based on those threat actors. And we have an assume compromise mindset, which is one of the things I talked about. So in essence, the best will in the world, the best technology, all of things, you have to assume someone can get into your network. And that's how we build all of our services. So when you think about the underpinning cloud platform itself, there are a couple of things that we have. So we have privileged access workstations. So there is zero way for you to use a corporate credential, so just normal login that you have, get access to email. You cannot pivot off of that credential into a production environment. So you have a completely different workstation and a completely different login. So even if an actor had been able to compromise through a phishing or lateral movement and they got that admin, what happens next is they are blocked in. So in essence, if you think about days of old where you might have had global admin, I know some companies still do this, hierarchy, global admin has access to everything. We don't have that, because if that is compromised, the whole thing shatters below it. And so we have obviously different admins for different things, but they only have access to a finite number of resources. And then we have just in time and just enough access. No one has open-ended access into any production environment. And so if you have to make a change and it's 5 minutes, you get 5 minutes. But every single change is authenticated. So they can't just go, I just give myself access, for 5 minutes and make this change. That doesn't work that way. And so in essence, the kind of privileged access manager, identity, and all of those things is absolutely critical. And again, if I put that into perspective with our incident response team, they used to be called DART, you might be familiar with them, Detection and Response Team. And so this is our team, if a customer is in the middle of a cyber attack, who will go and help with them in essence. So we pull logs from Defender, Sentinel, etc. One of the things that we identified, and it's the reason why I bring it up, is over 60% of all these incidents normally are ransomware. They've locked out their networks, or they've had data exfiltrated, etc. So when we've done that analysis and looked at what are the kind of the key denominators or key things that you learn from there, so 100% of all of those customers, very large customers, very small ones all over the world, did not have a privileged access workstation. So there's a kind of a lesson in itself if you want to know how to actually run a production environment. One of the other things that we identified, probably over 90% didn't have multi-factor authentication running on an admin. So there's another lesson in terms of how do you protect the environment. But the other thing on there is not all MFA is built the same. So what we're trying to do, you've probably even heard from a Microsoft perspective, we have the Authenticator app, you might be familiar with. In essence, that is getting number matching. Or what we have developed now is it gives you a little picture from where you're logging in from. And that's really to show you the impossible travel. So how could you be logging in from the UK and Nigeria from exactly the same point? And so it's just trying to get the person to think about what they're doing and really just kind of, doing the number matching and all of the things. Because what we are finding with attackers is every time you bring out new technology, they find a workaround. So we could say, over 80-90% of most credential attacks could be stopped with some kind of MFA, particularly if you think about password sprays and that kind of thing. But the attackers get wise to that, so they're just going to just bombard the individual with multiple requests coming through their mobile phone. And at some point, I'll just go, okay, I'm sorry, I can't, yes, it's fine. And then they just let everyone in. And so these are kind of the little things that you have to think about with regards to then, ultimately, how do you control? How do you manage the environment? And it really, I would say the most critical thing is identity. Identity of the person, identity of the device, wherever they're logging in from, whatever they're trying to get access to, and monitoring all of those things. But I think then, what are they after ultimately? They are after data. And from our perspective, the thing that is the most dangerous is probably source code. So if you could have source code for Windows, Azure, Xbox even, that's the thing that's dangerous. And so we have an assumed compromise on our source code as well, which means most people with the right privilege can view source code. So sometimes you'll probably see, I think it was even the case of SolarWinds, where the text said, I have the source code, Microsoft, and technically you don't. You can view it, you can't do anything with it. So for you to make a change on that source code or do anything with that source code, you need to go pivot from that workstation to this workstation, different network, blah, blah, blah. And so it's just thinking about all of those different layers, so that level of segmentation, the different identity, and then obviously thinking about ultimately what are they after, what is the value of that thing in different hands. Now the value of that thing is different if you're a nation state actor, a ransomware operator, an opportunist, or an activist. And you don't necessarily know of all of those who you're being attacked by, so you kind of have to assume you're being attacked by all of them. And that being said, what change in protocol, monitoring, credentials, information protection will you deploy as a result of that? And that's why I wanted to kind of tell the story that we base it on who the threat actors are, and therefore all of the myriad of controls that then have to be put in place to assume any and all of them, and new ones, because there are new ones coming through all the time, will try and have a go. And the only thing that separates them really is the will, motivation, and the persistence. So an opportunist will have a go if they can, but even a 0 day, the thing that people are worried about, even a 0 day, realistically speaking, is only either going to be in the hands of a government or someone who can afford it, which is probably a ransomware operator, and a very big one at that as well. So that's quite a
That was
lot
an answer.
to think about.
Okay, so if there's not a question in the room, we have.
So how concerned are you with the rise of quantum computers, which are going to be able to rather easily break all the standard encryption methods?
Well, we're building our own quantum as well. So we have our Microsoft Research Centre, I don't know if you're familiar with, in Cambridge. And so it's looking at all new evolving technology. So we have people looking at AI, we have people looking at quantum, the speed in which you can actually utilize the technology, how it will be deployed. And I think the thing that's important, what we try and look at is how do you use technology for good? But we know there is always going to be people using it for bad. And so it's a double-edged sword, in essence. We're trying to think about, is the world prepared for this technology and how this technology is going to be utilized? So yes, it's got lots of good things, but equally it's got lots of bad things. So I think to your point, it's probably people thinking it'll break encryption, traditional encryption, which then means you need a level of quantum encryption. But this is the kind of the thing that we're dealing with anyway. So at some point, when you think about things that might be under the Official Secrets Act or something like that, you're going back 25, 30 plus years, the level of encryption that was deployed at that point compared to now, at some point, you will be able to break all of that encryption and get access to all of the previous things that nobody wants to be available. So it's a constant catch-up in essence. So it's just like anything. It's just really considering the level of the technology, realistically speaking, how it's going to be utilised, how it's going to be built, how it's going to be protected. So we are considering quantum. We're just not in that sort of realm yet. If that makes sense.
I've got a question actually that actually came from one of our support teams, someone who'd not been with us long, and said, we hear the term zero trust bandied about, but what does that actually mean within Microsoft?
Yeah, it's quite simple, and some of that I've actually spoken about two of those already. So within Microsoft, we have assume compromise is principle one. Second principle is the principle of least privilege, which is the kind of something that I've already talked about. And the third principle is always verify. And it kind of comes back to what I was talking about, the level of trust that you have, either from an identity perspective, a devices perspective, and you can't just have an assumed level of trust. So you kind of do what normally happens if you have that kind of level of trust when you're logging in. And as long as everything looks fine and people kind of have unfettered access behind it, they can get access to any data, any systems, do whatever they need to do. And so what we're trying to do, that constant verification is not just at the point they log in, it's as they're in session, monitoring all of those different things. So from our perspective, it's about looking at those behavior analytics, it's machine learning, it's for you to understand what anomalous behavior is, you first need to know what normal behavior is. So you may have kind of heard about kind of conditional access. That's kind of one of the things which is that always verify. In essence, it used to be very black and white. Do you allow, do you deny? And now we've got multiple different situations where we're trying to be dynamic to the risk as it happens. And so in essence, what we're trying to understand is, do you know the difference between a compromised user versus a malicious user? Because arguably they're both going out of their way to change their behavior, what they do, how they're doing, they're changing their actions. And so we want to be able to monitor real time and take decisions real time. And that is in essence the kind of the pretext of the zero trust. It's that constant verification and then being able to take some action. So if everything looks normal, you're going to get full access into everything. So giving you an example, we are looking at about 250 different characteristics. So it's not just a case of the device that you log in or where you're logging in from. You have a very specific pattern that you may not even realize. And so when you log in on the morning, you might have a kind of thing that you do. You might go to your email. You might check Teams, you might do various different things, and you will do that in a very specific way. And so when that starts to change, we go, hang on a minute, well, something's different here. And that's not saying that something's malicious, but it then starts triggering and tracking and doing various things. So another example might be as we were coming out of COVID and people were kind of going into the office, they stop off at Starbucks, whatever, utilize Starbucks VPN, and they're like, something's changed in the environment. What do I do? So if they use their password, I might force MFA. I'm not quite sure as to possible travel and all of the things. I can quarantine the user, quarantine the device. I can force a password reset. I can do multiple different things. And that's in essence what we're trying to do. It's the balance between security and productivity, because we absolutely want people to do all the things they need to do, but they need to be balanced and do it in the right way and for the right reasons. And that's where that constant monitoring, constant understanding of the risk and how the risk is changing is how we're building that kind of zero trust principle into all technology and how it all integrates together. So hopefully that answers the question.
Is there anybody from the room? I think we're nearly there. I've got one question actually that was written by someone else. I can't actually read. So basically it's talking about having all your defences in Microsoft. So I guess it would be, what's your view on that, on how safe that is for people?
Well, I think this is a kind of a misnomer. I think that obviously we have a platform approach. So even from a security perspective, we'll have Defender. We've got Sentinel, we've got all of these different things, and kind of some customers think that over whatever period they've gone for this kind of best of breed. They've got multiple different tools and technologies, and do I have to get rid of all my tools and move to Microsoft? No, it's a simple answer, and I would argue you don't want to do that either. Because there's obviously that little concern that I have all eggs in one basket. But there's probably might be something that gets missed. In actual fact, the best thing is to think about, I know I'm Microsoft, I'm a little bit biased, but having Microsoft as the baseline level of security, if you like, because of that extended detection response, because of the level of signals that we have, but integrate in all of the other technologies. Now you might think that's a bit of a cost, increase. And so what we're looking at is duplication. There may be opportunities for you to consolidate remove some products, but you're going to have some very niche products, I imagine, or some products that you absolutely love, or that some people in your business is really wedded to, because they like the vendor or they like the product or whatever. But actually, so I think the real thing is the balance, the integration. And if people kind of say to you, you need to get rid of all the things and go to Microsoft, you can tell them to admit that I said you don't, unless that is an objective, but it's not a requirement. So I just want to make sure that people understand that.
It's actually quite nice to hear a vendor not saying just buy me, just buy our products. So I think that's, we've got time for coffee now. So coffee, you'll be pleased to know, you don't have to walk upstairs, it's just through here. And then we will be back here at 10 to, please. Lovely, and thank you very much, Sarah.
You're welcome.